Hello everyone and welcome back to Rare Japanese Sounds, where every month I show you just a snapshot of what I've been buying over the last month, whether it be Japanese records, CD, cassettes, any piece of Japanese media related to music, I like it. And boy, this month do I have a lot to show you. There are tons of very rare and expensive items that I really want to get into with you, and just a preview, but if you manage to hang out until the very end, I will show you why this white VHS I think is worth more than $1,000. And without further ado, let's get into it. And by order, of course, of least to most rare and expensive records, we're going to start by Anri's Timely album. This one is of course a big fan favorite, and it has been surging in popularity for at least a few years now and has become a staple of city pop. What I really like about this album is first the fact that I bought it in a local record shop in Okinawa actually, and the fact that I paid only $3 for it, which I found was pretty great for an album this classic, and it shows you that sometimes not all record shops are up to date on the actual values of all their albums. Of course, this one, if you get a bit close, you realize that the condition is not really great in any way, but it was so cheap that I couldn't not buy it, and I always have a bit more, I feel more connected to the things that I buy in person as opposed to on auction or on the internet. Something that not all of you might know is if you look at the top left corner of the record, so in the obi, you will see this piece of text that is not present usually in other records. That's because it tells you that for the 50,000 first records to be sold, you have what they call a fashion calendar, showing Anri in, doing idle things for a calendar of the year 1988, 87, I don't remember. But this was limited to only the 50,000 first copies, and it's pretty rare to see it on a random copy of the album, because only about maybe 10% of those would have had it. Anyway, I don't have actually the calendar with that copy, but for 300 yen or $3, you really can't ask for much more. Moving on to another staple of city pop albums, we have After Five Clash by Toshiki Kadomatsu. And of course, now Toshiki Kadomatsu is considered probably among the right at the top of city pop artists, almost a legend in what he was doing. And of course, all of his albums throughout the 80s have been complete hits, and this one is a real banger, if I can say so myself. And what I really like about this particular copy is just the condition of it. It's extremely rare to find copies of popular albums like that. So when you look at copies of ambient albums and all that, it's pretty different because it's not the same type of people that bought them. But for this kind of album, to find it first with the obi is not that easy, of course, but to find it, like really, if you look at the cover, it's completely clean, not a speck, not an indent on the jacket. It's really rare to see something like that on record this old, and people didn't take care of their records that well back then. So I'm really happy about that. Just to give you an idea of the price, it's probably around $30, maybe a bit less. It's again pretty cheap because it was a popular album back then, but for like what you're getting as far as music quality goes and just the value you're getting, it's such a great buy that I would definitely recommend that you do so if you find a similar opportunity. Moving on to an album that I think is a bit more niche than the previous ones, but it is from an artist that was very popular back in the day. I'm talking about Mioko Yamaguchi's compilation album, Anju. But I say compilation, but there are two songs that were unique to this album and produced for an anime with the same name. Anyway, this album is actually much rarer, much harder to find than her regular albums. That's why I was interested in it, and it's actually the first of her albums that I listened to when I first discovered her. So I really wanted to get my hands on this compilation, and it took much longer than I anticipated. But the price was, again, pretty cheap. I think I only paid about $30 to $40 for it, which I think is great value for a compilation that is this rare, that has two exclusive songs. And actually the compilation has been released as a CD, reissued as a CD in 2017 with a bonus 7-inch that contains the two exclusive tracks. So if you want to have the main benefits of the compilation on record, you can try to buy the reissue because it gives you basically the same thing. But I As you know, I always love to have the original. This one I think has a pretty interesting history behind it, and I think it's a great purchase just because it's very rare and quite interesting. And now, as you can see, we're moving into the big hitters with Tomoko Aran's album Fuyu Kukan, which has now become almost a synonym with city pop and almost some kind of future funk. And you can see the genre, especially from the two songs I'm in Love and Midnight Pretenders, that have become so widely known that those two songs alone have propelled the price of the album above $100, $150. This one is of course the original, but it has been reissued, even though the reissue, I was very surprised to find it more expensive than I would have thought. Like, it's almost $60 to $70, and at this price range it's very easy to try and find a copy of the original. I think this one only set me back right above $100, which is really cheap for what we're getting. We're talking about a legendary album of modern city pop, and what people just know from a glance when looking at the cover. There is no mistake about what you're getting. So that's why I definitely think it's a good buy, but remember that this kind of album used to be very cheap, and maybe in 20 years it will be as cheap as it used to be. So be pretty careful with this kind of album and don't expect it to stay that way forever. I just wanted the album, I didn't care about the price. And I think that's the general guideline for buying records, especially Japanese records, because it's such a new market. 5 years ago it almost didn't exist, and now everybody and their mother is buying that kind of records. But remember, it's not really about the price, it's about what those albums mean to you, and whether you care about the price, and whether you would feel sad if those albums ever went down in price. And pro tip, if you are sad if these albums went down in price, you shouldn't buy them at all, because there are lots of ways to enjoy the music. Just listening to the MP3 is good enough in most cases. Anyway, those were my 2 cents, and let's move on to the next. Alright, I think by this point most of you have seen my video on Alessandra's Mussolini Amore album, and I will put a link for you to watch it if you haven't. But if you haven't, you might be pretty surprised to learn that the granddaughter of the Italian dictator Mussolini went into making one music album in her young career. And more strange than that, that album was actually produced in Japan and featured 2 songs in Japanese that were sung by Alessandra Mussolini herself, which is pretty unique as far as I know. I don't know of anyone else who has done that ever, at least in the 80s, and in genres related to city pop. So this is a very curious album in many ways, and the fact that it is still findable for easily under $100 is pretty surprising, given that the fact that she's already well known, even if it's not in a good way, well known everywhere around the world, and that the album itself is pretty good. Like, not gonna lie, the album, musically speaking, is not bad. So all those factors combined, I think the album should be way over $100, but it's not. So I managed to get my hands on one copy here, and yeah, it's the kind of album where it's not easy to bring up in a video like that. I don't want to bring up controversy about the person, I just want to talk about the album and the fact that it's honestly a great piece of media for Japanese city pop, and something that we don't have a lot of examples of foreign artists collaborating in a Japanese environment for producing an album like that, only in Japan. So with that in mind, I hope that you forgive me bringing it up, but it's a very interesting album, and I hope that you will understand that. So you might hear me say fan favorite album a lot, but this one is actually one of my personal favorites, and I have loved Makoto Matsushita's first album, First Light, for a long time. Really, because I think it's almost the pinnacle of musical quality for city pop. It has such like a great range of emotions, and just the instrumentals, the vocals, everything is just on point, and it has just the right amount of rarity to make it expensive enough for a collector's item. And of course it has now been reissued a couple times, and it's great to have seen it be reissued and more accessible to people. And actually now the rarest version of it might be the 1982 reissue that had the different cover art from this one, but of course this one is the original on the Air Records label, whereas the reissue was on the Moon Records label. Honestly, that might not mean anything to you, but just remember that this is the original, and honestly I just like everything about it. The condition is not the best. If you want to get into the details, you can see like some signs of wear around the jacket, but I just wanted to have a copy for myself that I could listen to, and this one is pretty much the right grade for that. I'm not afraid to put it on the turntable if I had one, but that's a debate for another time. And the last record I bought this month are actually 2 records that I purchased together at Face Records. Shout out to them. And if you know this channel, you might also know that I'm a big fan of the Shizen label, which is like a new age kind of Japanese Windham Lee Hills record label. And those 2 albums are compilation albums that were released by Shizen at the end of 1986. And those 2 albums show different sides of the label. First, you have 1986, that's pretty much more on the classic side of new age, more acoustic, more piano, more things like that. But 1987, you start to have a few tracks that are more heavy on synths, and you have a few guitar tracks that are exclusive to this album and not findable anywhere else. So that's why this compilation from 87 is a bit more expensive than the 86 one. But the 2 of them are actually very hard to find, especially nowadays that they have started to pick up steam from more and more people knowing about those records. And that's why I've been pretty happy to buy them. And I hope that someday they will get reissued, because the problem is none of the Shizen label albums have been reissued in any way, although they are available on most streaming platforms. So at least that's the thing. And we can be hopeful that they might reissue them in some way someday. But alright, enough with the records, and let's get into things that are really, really rare, because now we are moving on to cassette tapes. And if you know, if you are familiar with collecting Japanese music, you will know that cassette tapes are usually much harder to find than CD and even records. And the first one I'm going to show you, you might have already seen it if you follow me on Instagram, but this is an album that probably needs no introduction, because it is the album This Boy by Hiroshi Sato, now a very, very famous city pop album. But that wasn't the case necessarily 5 years ago. Actually, 5 years ago, the price of the record was cheaper than the price of the CD, itself cheaper than the cassettes. Now, of course, the tides have turned, and the LP is worth between $100 and $150, depending on the condition and so on. But the cassette remains the hardest way to find this album on media. Actually, I got this one for not too expensive, because the back of the O card has been cut. I have no idea why. Probably to make it like to fit the O card inside the case. I really don't have any comment to say about that, but the fact is I managed to get it for around $40 if I remember correctly. Whereas if you get it in perfect condition with a complete O card, it's like at least $250 to $300. It's an extremely hard cassette tape to find. Now, another album by Hiroshi Sato on cassette that I had never heard of until a week ago is this. Now, I think it warrants just a good look at the cover of this album. It's called like Sato Hiroshi's Gourmet Keyboard something. This is very interesting because it came as a special edition of the Keyboard magazine, and they made like a dozen of those special editions in which professional pianists came and gave explanations on how to create music or various things. And in this case, Hiroshi Sato gave some kind of lecture on how to make music in different ways. So you have like at least 7 or 8 tracks, and they probably show you like different ways to make certain types of a style for your instrumentals. It comes with a small booklet with like explanations by Hiroshi Sato, and you might not see it very well, but you also have a few like a couple of sheet music. And you also have of course the cassette tape itself. This one is sealed, so I'm not gonna take it out and listen to it. So hopefully I find another copy that is not sealed so I can listen to it. But if anyone has any info on what's actually inside, I would be very curious to hear it. Now we are approaching the end, but before the item that you have been waiting for, I have a very last one that I think you will recognize and enjoy, because it's actually this. It's Watering a Flower by Haruomi Hosono. So we're talking about ambient music, but this is one probably of the most well-known ambient music albums from Japan. Of course, Haruomi Hosono is extremely well-known. But for those of you who have never seen the actual cassette book it came with back in the day, so you have a small book with a lot of pictures, and I think some of them are not very fit for YouTube, so I'm not going to show everything, and I will let you see that by yourself. And of course, in addition to the book, you have the cassette. But actually, this one has the particularity of still being sealed, so I don't really want to take the cassette out, seeing that it's extremely rare to find this kind of thing still sealed. So I'm just going to leave it as is. But you should know that it has become a very, very expensive cassette tape, like upwards of $250, becoming harder and harder to find. But there is a reissue coming in November, and I'm not exactly sure what the reissue is, but it seems to be a cassette, and it should contain the whole album, but I'm not sure about that point. Anyway, it's coming in November, and it's actually very cheap, like it's $15. You can grab it from Amazon, but I think it's a limited edition because most places are already sold out. So make sure to check with your local shop or your local importer to see if you can get it, but it's a good way to get the music for a reasonable price. And finally, for those of you who have stuck until the end of this video, or if you have just skipped to here, I don't care. Here you have it. This is a promotional VHS tape for Tatsuro Yamashita's Joy album from 1989. So you might be wondering, well, why is that rare or valuable in any way? So let me explain a little. Of course, if you know this channel, you probably know Tatsuro Yamashita. He's one of the most famous city pop artists out there, and while he's now at least very famous in the West, he's even more so in Japan, where he has had like a big fan club for at least 40 years, and it's called the Tatsuro Mania. And they are, really, really into collecting pieces of memorabilia by Tatsuro Yamashita, and they have like several magazines per year where they talk about just their idol. So Tatsuro Yamashita is he's a big deal in Japan, and he has been for a very long time. Now the Joy album, that's one that you might not know if you're not very, very much into city pop. And the reason is, Joy is some kind of compilation of songs that Tatsuro performed live between something like 1982 and 1989. And those songs have been put together and like into one big 140 minutes long album, which is pretty long. So they put it on CD, they put it on cassette, they also put it in a very limited triple LP record. And that record now is fetching for between $1,000 and $1,500. So it is a big deal, and even though it's not very well known in the West, people in Japan are paying a lot to have that premium LP. So you understand now how Joy is probably one of the most desired album by Tatsuro Yamashita. And that also comes from the fact that he performed very, very influential songs, one of which being Plastic Love. So you can imagine Tatsuro Yamashita, one of the most famous city pop artists, performing the most famous city pop song by his wife, of course. You realize like the impact of such an album on the city pop fandom. And now you get to this, which is a promotional VHS tape that was handed out to stores all around Japan and that was playing, extracts from the album, but not just the sound, also the video that came with it. So you have the additional experience of like seeing Tatsuro perform the songs. And in particular for this tape, you have different versions that exist. This one is, I think, 8 minutes long. And it shows like a very short extracts of a few different tracks, but one of them is Plastic Love. So you probably start to understand the interest of the cassette as a collector. Now, one additional factor that is important in understanding the rarity of this cassette is seeing that it is numbered, and the number is, when it will focus, the number is 1269, which means that only probably a couple thousands of those were made. If you look at the number of this one, we can deduce that not 10,000 were made. Probably it was more probably along the lines of 2,000 to 3,000. But those were just promotional items. They weren't meant to be kept. So how many of those still exist today? Probably maybe a couple hundred, but that's very hard to say. Who would keep a VHS like 30 years down the line? It's probably not something that most stores would have kept, and even if they had kept it, like what are the chances they are still around today? So now you understand why it's an important collector's item for city pop, also why it's rare. And it's so rare, in fact, that I've only managed to find it once sold on Yahoo Auctions since 2015. It was once in 2016 and it sold for 50,000 yen, but it was sold instantly in just a few hours after it was listed. So it shows you that the actual price of this cassette was way above 50,000 yen, but back in 2016, the actual LP, the triple LP for Joy, cost less than the price of the cassette. It was only worth maybe 40,000 yen back in the day, but now the triple LP for Joy is worth more than $1,000. So if this cassette is actually worth more than the Joy album, it should actually be be worth more than $1,000. It's really something to think about. But when you get down to this type of item that is so rare that you have very few people who identify enough to the item and have the funds necessary to purchase it. By the way, I only purchased this because it was listed for less than $200 on Mercari, and I just bought it right away. And yeah, it's a very, very, very special item, and I think a lot of people would love to have that, and I'm extremely proud to have it in my collection. It's not the kind of item that you see every day. Well, I do hope that someday we will see like the integrality of the Joy album just in video and released maybe on Blu-ray or something. It would really be great. But for now, this is the only trace we have of Tatsuro Yamashita performing live the songs of the Joy album, including Plastic Love. So it's really a great item. I'm glad to have it, and I hope that it was worth the hype of you sticking around until the end of this video. In any case, that was a lot of stuff in just 1 month, and probably next month I will be dialing down on all the things I buy. But we'll see, it depends on what kind of items I get to find on auction or on record shops. So we'll see until next month. But meanwhile, if you have any comments to say or if you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave a comment, put a like, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram if you want to see more things like that before I show them on video. And this was Where Japanese Sounds. Hope you enjoyed the videos as always, and until next time, stay tuned.